Thanks for visiting my channel. Today I am going to talk on one of the most important concept of Angular, and that is HTTP service. So in this video, you will come across with what is service, why we need a service, how to use service in Angular, and many more interview questions on HTTP service, which you might get asked in Angular interview. So to take the benefit of all questions, I would request you to watch this video till end. And one more request, if you learn anything from this video, then please help me by subscribing to my channel. As I have recently started my channel, so any new subscriber will motivate me to make more such videos. So today's agenda is, why do we need service? We will try to understand this question with different cases. We are going to see these three use cases where we need service, such as to create business logic, to share data, and to interact with the database. So first, we will understand how we can create business logic. So to understand the first use case, here we can see two components with follow button, and the both follow buttons are doing same thing. So in order to follow the user, we need to write some logic inside follow method. And that follow button logic will get executed whenever user click on the follow button of any component. So for that, what we used to do, we can write one click event on a follow button, and we can write the method inside ts file of same component. So we can do that for both the component. But in future, you have more than two components. Then also if we do the same thing, like we are defining the method of follow button in a same component, then it will increase the number of lines of code, and we are repeating same code in different component. And because of this, we are violating the dry principle of Angular. So in that case, what we need to do in that case, we have to create one file, and we can write that follow button logic inside that file. That file is called as service file. So once you write this follow button logic inside service file, any component can access that service file by injecting that service inside the component. So in future, if you have a four component, whichever component wants that follow button logic, that component can inject that service and take the benefit of follow button logic. So the same use case we can see through example. So for that, let's jump into the Visual Studio Code. I am going to demonstrate the first use case of a service, that is to share business logic. For that, as discussed in PPT, I am going to create two components. One is app component and another is user component. So I will create a UI for app component. I have added the HTML code for app component. That you can see I have added one post and added one follow button. So now I want to add the method on click of this follow button. I'll add one click function and I'll call one method follow for more, and I need to define this method inside ts file. So inside this method, what I have to define, I have to add the user inside database. I have to allow the user to see more post or future post. Today, I am not going to write the logic for this. I'm just quickly sending the alert. When you click on that button, you'll get one alert. Thanks for following us, like that, because we need to understand the concept of service. So that is why I'm not going to write the logic inside follow for more method. So now you can see on the browser, once I click on this follow button, you are getting one thank you for following us message. Now what I want to do, I want to add one more post in different component, and I want the same logic on click of follow button. So that I'll do quickly. So for that, I have created one user component. Inside that user component, I'll copy the code of app component and I'll add, and I'll do some changes. So I have added one more test inside user component. You can see in the browser. Now we have a two posts. One is inside app component and one is inside user component. And I have a two follow buttons in two separate posts. So the first follow button is throwing the alert message, and I want the same alert message on click of this follow button as well. So for that, what I need to do, I need to write same event and the same method I need to paste inside user component as well, so that I'll get the same message. So now you can see on click of follow button, I'm getting same thank you for following us message. So here we have a two post. If in case we have a 4 post or 5 post, then what we need to do? We need to copy the same method and we need to add into the all post. Is that the right method? No. Why? Because same code is repeated in 3 or 4 different component classes. Then we are violating the dry principle of Angular. That is, do not repeat yourself. So component class should only be responsible for representing the UI to the user. But what we are doing, we are adding the business logic inside component class. So component class is only responsible for the UI. But this follow button is not a UI logic. This is a business logic. We are mixing the business logic inside component logic, and that is not a good practice, because presenting logic must be separated from business logic to make components more maintainable. So for that, what we need to do, we need to create one separate file, and we can add logic behind follow button inside that separate file, and we can call that file inside the component, so that in future if you have more component, then you can only fetch the follow button logic from that separate file. You don't have to repeat the code in the future component. So for that, I have created one service that is called user service. So here I am going to paste this method inside user service. I'll just change the name, follow more service. Okay, and I'm going to delete logic from component. So we will do with user component first, and then we'll go on an app component. So in order to use the service, we need to inject that service inside component through constructor. So I'm going to create one private variable, one local variable to use user service of type user service. Make sure you have to import this service. Now we can use the service data by using local variable user. So user dot follow more service. So now I'm going to save the changes and go to the browser. We did changes for user component. So I'm clicking on the follow button of user component, and I'm getting the same response which we are getting from component level. But this time this message is coming from a service, not from a component. So the same thing we have to do with app component as well. So I need to, in order to use this service, I need to inject that service through constructor. Save the changes, and you can see on the browser, I am getting the same message. What I did here, I have created two component. Inside that two component, I have created two separate posts with one follow button. And on click of that follow button, one function is getting called, and that function is common for both the component. That function first I have added in a separate component. But if in future, if I have a more component, then we can't repeat the code in all components. So for that, we have created one service, and we have added that function, follow button function, inside that service, and we inject that service in a component. Whichever component you want the follow button logic, you can inject that service inside that component, and you can call the method from that component. That's it. So just we have seen the example of how to share business logic. So now the second use case is to share data. So here I have a data in the form of array, and we have a 3 component. If I want to use this data in component A, then I can just copy this data and paste inside component 1. And I can display this data with the help of HTML file. But if I want the same data inside component 1, component 2 and component 3. Then if I copy this data and paste inside 2 and 3 component like this, then this is not a good practice. Why? Because I am repeating this code in 3 different components. I am increasing the number of lines of code and I am not taking the benefit of reusability. So that is why the solution for this issue is service. So what service can do? Here is the example of service with dummy data. So I have this dummy data. So if I insert this dummy data inside a service file, then I don't need to write the same data inside component 1, component 2, component 3. Rather, I need to inject this service file inside whichever component I want this data. Just we need to inject that file and we can access that data. So because of this, we are not repeating the code in all 3 components and we are not increasing the number of lines of code. We can see this with example. To understand the second use case of service, that is to share data between components, I have an array of data and I stored this data inside a local variable that is users. So now I have to map this users array inside HTML. So for that I have created one table inside app component and mapped the users variable with ngFor. So to save the changes and go to the browser, now you can see the table inside app component and this is the users table which is coming from the TS file, which we have added the data inside TS file. So now what I want one more component and inside that I want to fetch only username from this array only. So for that I have already created users component for the first use case. So for that I'll add the table from app component and paste it inside users component. I'll edit the name. This is not an app data, this is user component data. And I don't want IT name and I don't want email field as well. So I'll delete from here. Okay. So now for users array, I need a data from app component. So I'll copy this data and I'll add it inside your users TS component. So now I have the users data and I mapped this data inside HTML. Now I can access the username from here. Save the changes and go to the browser. I want this text to be center. So I'll add the class text center. So I have added bootstrap for this table. See, now you can see the user component data as well. But user component is accessing only username from this app component data. So in future, if we want the email field from this app component inside the other component, what I need to do, I need to copy this array again from app component and I need to paste it inside another component like we just did for user component. But this is not a good practice. Why? Because we are repeating the same code in different component. And this is again violating the dry principle of Angular, that is, do not repeat yourself. So the solution for this is we need to create one service and we can add this data inside that service. And we can fetch that data from service, like any component can fetch that data from service by just injecting that service inside component. Why we need to add data inside service? Why? Because in future, inside app component, if we add 3 more users and I save the changes and go to the browser, you can see that changes is applicable for app component only. But we need that username of this table inside user component. But this changes is not reflecting on user data because we have used a separate array for user component as well as app component. To access these 3 array inside user data, we need to add this data inside service so that it is applicable for all component. We don't need to do the changes in each and every component. So I'll do that quickly. So we have created one user service. I will add this array inside user service. I'll create one method inside user service, get all users, and inside that I'll paste this array. I'll return this array. So now we have a data inside service. So we can delete this data from TS file and we just need to declare property users. So first I'll do the changes inside app component, then we will move to users component. Now to fetch the service data inside component, we need to add that code inside ng on init lifecycle hook. For that, we need to implement on init lifecycle hook, and we can define the ng on init lifecycle hook, and inside that we can write the service related code. Why we need to write this code inside ng on init? Why? Because ng on init hook will get called once our component has been initialized. So that is why we have to call the service inside ng on init lifecycle hook. So I am going to use user local variable to call the service data. So for users dot, what method we have written? We have written get all users method. So now I am getting all data inside get all users. So what I need to do? I need to store this data inside our local variable, that is users. And that users variable we have already mapped with HTML of app component. So save the changes and go to the browser. Now we are getting this data from service, not from a component. So do the same changes inside users array. So I'll do that quickly. So I'll remove this array from user component and I'll save the changes. Now you can see this users component data is also coming from service. If the users are added in future, then we just need to add it inside service file, and you can save the changes and go to the browser. This data is reflecting on app component as well as user component. You don't need to add the array inside app as well as user component. So that is the benefit of using service. So now in future, if you have added few more components and that component wants this data, this user data, then that component only needs to inject that service and they can fetch this data inside the component. So what we did, we have created two components here, and first we have added array of data inside the TS file and mapped that array with HTML, and we can see the data on the browser. And we did this for app component as well as user component. But what we are doing, we are repeating the code. We are repeating the array inside our app component as well as user component. That is why we delete the array from app component as well as user component and paste that array inside service file. And to access the service file data, we inject that service inside app component as well as user component, and through ng on init, we access that service. And we can display the data on the browser. So we have seen how we can access dummy data from service in last use case. Now this is the third use case, interaction with database. So in live project, we need to work on bulk of data, rather small amount of data. And that bulk of data come through REST API or backend API. So instead of writing dummy data inside service, in this case, we need to add REST API inside service and use that service in component by injecting that service. So I want to explain HTTP service architecture. So here we have a database, we have a data inside database, we have a service, and we have a component. So in Angular project, we are creating one service and component. We don't have a database in Angular project. But if we need a data, what we used to do, we used to add the REST API inside service. But by adding API inside service, we can't access the data from that API. The service needs to send HTTP GET request to the database, and once HTTP GET request received from service, database send the data in the form of observable to the service. Now service is holding the API data in the form of observable, and observables are lazy because when we subscribe to the observable, then only observables will execute. So to access this API data, component has to subscribe to that observable. Then only component can access that data. So this is the complete HTTP service architecture. So now we can see how to fetch the data from REST API inside our application. For that, I'm going inside Visual Studio Code. So far, we have seen how to share data between component and how to share business logic. Now we will see how to interact with database. We worked with dummy data till now. But in live project, we need to work with bulk of data, and that bulk of data comes from API. So today we are going to take a dummy JSON API from JSON placeholder. So for that, you have to go to the browser and type JSON placeholder. Click on the first link. Here we see in this example of user. So we will take the users API and copy that users API and paste it inside service and with one local variable API URL equals to this. So in order to access this HTTP URL, we need to import HttpClientModule in app.module.ts file. So this is the first step we need to do when you are working with HTTP service. HTTP client module, and that we need to import from Angular common HTTP. HTTP client module from Angular common HTTP package. So this is the first step. Now the second step is we need to inject the HTTP client inside service through constructor. Private HTTP of type HTTP client, and that also import from Angular common HTTP. We have injected HTTP client and we have imported HTTP client module. Then the third step is we need to return this HTTP request inside get all users. So I'm going to delete this dummy data and going to call the API. So now what this get all users method is doing, this service is sending the HTTP get request to database, then only database can send the API response. So now I am returning the HTTP get request, http.get, and inside that I'm going to pass the API URL. So now this method, API all users method, is holding the data from this API, and the data is available in observable format, and observables are lazy. To access this observable data, we need to subscribe that observable from component. To access the get all users method data, we need to subscribe that method from component.html file. For that, I'm going to delete this and I'm subscribing this method from TS file. So in order to subscribe, we need to write one callback method response, and I'm going to store this response data inside my local variable, that is users equals to the response. Now I'm going to save the changes and go to the browser. Here we can see now this data is coming from REST API, not from dummy data. We have deleted the dummy data and we did the interaction with database, like we are accessing the REST API. And I have already mapped this users inside HTML file with ng for loop. See, now I can see the ID, name, username, and email from this URL. Sorry, in this URL. Just save the changes and go to the browser. See, now you can see the data is coming from a API. This is not a dummy data. This data is coming from a REST API. Similarly, we need to access the username inside user component. So for that, again, I need to go inside user component, and in that component, I need to subscribe the service method. Subscribe this method, and I need to add one fat arrow function inside method. So here, again, I'm going to store this data inside users variable. That's it. And we have already mapped this users with .html file. You can see this with ng for loop. So now we can see only the usernames. So you can see I am getting 10 usernames from this users, because in this JSON we are getting 10 users. Okay. So this is how we can interact with database by using REST API. So what we did, the first step is we need to import the HTTP client module inside app.module.ts. The second step, we need to inject the HTTP client through constructor inside service, and then we can send the HTTP GET request to database and we will get the data in the form of observable. So to access the observable form data into component, the component has to subscribe that method. So from user component as well as from app.component.ts, we have subscribed to the get all user method and we receive the data in response, and we store that data inside local variable users and we mapped that with HTML of same component, and we can see the API data on browser. So this is the third use case of service. Now we will see the interview questions on service. Now we'll talk on first interview question on HTTP service, that is, what is service? Service is a reusable TypeScript class that can be used in multiple components across our Angular application. Next question is, what are the uses of service? We can use service to share data with different components. With the help of service, we can do the connection with database. Also, service help us in not repeating the code. With the creation of service, we can share business logic across the Angular application. Now, the third question is, what is dependency injection? What is mean by dependency? Dependency is an object that can be depend on any other object, and injection is the process of passing a dependency to the dependent object. It actually creates a new instance of a class along with its required dependencies. You can say dependency injection is a software design pattern that deals with how components get hold of their dependency. It's a way to create object that depends upon another object. Next question is, what is HTTP client and HTTP client module? HTTP client is a built-in service class available in @Angular common HTTP package. The HTTP client is more modern and easy to use, and it's an alternative of HTTP because HTTP client is an improved replacement of HTTP. HTTP client is used to perform HTTP request and RxJS observable based API, which means it returns the observable and we need to subscribe it. What is HTTP client module? HTTP client module is a replacement of HTTP module. The new HTTP client service is included in the HTTP client module that used to initiate HTTP request and responses in Angular application. The next question is, what are the ways to provide service in Angular application? I want to answer this question with practical example. So there are three different ways to provide service in Angular. So first way is using provided in metadata with the root value inside @injectable decorator, or we can add the service inside providers array of app.module.ts. So I'll just quickly show you. Right now our application is working as expected. You can see here we are getting data, app component data as well as user component data. Once I comment this provided in metadata, you can see nothing is loaded. So, but if I add the user service inside providers array, and save the changes and go to the browser, you can see the data is loaded. So the first way to provide service is either you can add inside @injectable, or you can add the user service inside providers array of app.module.ts. And the second way is to add the user service inside the component providers array. So I'll show you that as well. So I'll delete this user service from app.module.ts and I'll add it inside app component. You can see nothing is loaded on browser, but once I add inside the providers array of app.component.ts file, you can see the data. Save the changes and see on the browser. Data is loaded. So this is the second way we have added user component inside app.component.html. That is why we are getting data from both the component, because the user data is a child of app. User component is a child of app component. Okay. So the third way is, so right now we didn't created any feature module, but in future if you have created any feature module, then you can add this providers array inside feature module. So this service is applicable for that module only, but right now we don't have the feature module, so I can't show you that, but hope you understand this, how we can provide service. So now we'll jump to the next question, and that is how to create only one instance of a service through the application. So once you provide the service through provided in metadata or through app.module.ts providers array, then using both the places, only one instance of a service is getting created. So the next question is, what is singleton service in Angular? Singleton is a class that allows only a single instance of itself to be created and gives access to that created instance. A singleton service is a service for which only one instance exists in the application. And the last question is, what is the difference between provided in and providers? If the service is registered with provided in metadata and if this service is used throughout the application, then only it will create the memory, or else it will not create a memory. And if the service is registered in providers array, then it will create a memory once the application load on web. Doesn't matter this service is used throughout the application or not. So it means this is the best approach to provide service, because with the help of this, memory will get created if we used this service in the application. If we didn't use, then memory will not get created. So that is why to provide the service through provided in metadata is the best approach. So hope you like this video. If you learn something from this video, then please do like, share, and don't forget to subscribe my channel. Thank you. Bye bye.